Who discovered America? For such a seemingly simple and trivial question, this is among the most prevalent historical controversies of the modern day. For centuries, there was a broad consensus that Italian explorer Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, or more generally, the existence of land in the Western Hemisphere. In recent decades, however, this long-celebrated navigator has come under scrutiny, and consequently forced us to rethink the way we view him. The image of Columbus in the American public consciousness is a story all its own, one we don't have time to discuss today, but it has undoubtedly shaped the way we examine this question. Now, what exactly do we mean when we ask who discovered America? Because if the question asks about the first humans ever to reach the Americas, the answer is very plain. Somewhere between 21 and 23,000 years ago, humans crossed over a land bridge connecting what we now know as Kamchatka and Chukotka in eastern Siberia to what we now know as Alaska. That land bridge became submerged under the Bering Strait around 10,000 years ago, and thus the hemispheres were separated. So that answers the question, right? Case closed. Well, not exactly, because of course we're not really asking that particular question. More correctly, we're asking, when did the Old World of Europe, Africa, and Asia discover the Americas again? For centuries, the answer to that was of course our old friend Christopher Columbus, who made landfall on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola in 1492, bringing the knowledge back to Europe and kicking off the Age of Exploration. Since then, and until very recently, most have credited Columbus with the discovery of the Americas. Of course, Columbus didn't know that he'd found another continent, and he believed to his dying day that he'd found a route to Asia, but one way or another, the consequences of his fateful voyage have echoed throughout world history for the last 500 years. Unfortunately, so have his many crimes. Murder, mass rape, slavery, torture, all things that the ever-wondrous American public schooling system often chooses to omit when teaching us about Columbus. For over a century, we've propagated bald-faced lies about this man, unintentionally turning one of history's worst monsters into one of our most vaunted heroes. But at last, the myth is breaking apart. In the 10 or so years since I was first taught about him in elementary school, social attitudes towards Columbus have radically shifted. As colonial societies across the world have been forced to reevaluate their past, Columbus has come into the crosshairs, and many of the lies we were taught about him have been completely dismantled. However, in the process of trying to dispel ahistorical myths, I'm afraid we've created a few of our own, and at last, we arrive at the title of this video. You see, in the backlash against Columbus, an idea has spread that he didn't even discover the Americas. Now, as we went over earlier, he definitely didn't on a technical level, but even among the inhabitants of the Eastern Hemisphere, Columbus has found competition in the history books. That competition comes in the form of, among others, the infamous Vikings of medieval Scandinavia. In particular, the Norse explorer Leif Erikson landed on the shores of Newfoundland in the year 1001 after being blown off course on the way to Greenland. There he founded the settlement of Vinland, named after the abundance of grapes in the region, and it lasted for 10 years. See, as it turns out, a band of poorly supplied Vikings, far from home with no knowledge of the terrain, no clear purpose for being there, and under constant attack by hostile natives, aren't going to last particularly long. The site was abandoned completely, and wasn't uncovered until the 1960s. And that's just it. No one knew that the Vikings had ever been to North America until 900 years after they were gone. Their supposed discovery had no notable impact on either the American Indians or the Europeans who encountered them. Columbus's discovery, on the other hand, altered the course of history in a manner that few can match. He almost single-handedly began the Age of Exploration, and half a millennium of European colonialism. Before Columbus, countries in the Middle East, China, and India were the geopolitical center of the world, but with shiny new empires and massive new wealth, Europe rapidly came to dominate global affairs. Columbus may not have been the first person to reach the Americas from the Old World, not even the second, but in the context of the modern day, he did discover the Americas. For the purposes of geopolitics and history as they apply to us today, the peoples who crossed over the Bering Land Bridge became separated from the continent they came from and were forgotten, while the Vikings are little more than a fun historical footnote. On the other hand, Christopher Columbus, for all his cruelty, vanity, and downright stupidity, did bring knowledge of the Western Hemisphere back to Europe. Remove Leif Erikson from the equation, and absolutely nothing changes beyond the very small sphere of Vinland. While, if you remove Columbus, you remove the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Spanish and Portuguese empires that followed, the destruction of the native civilizations in Central and South America, the geopolitical realignment of the world towards the Atlantic Ocean, both the creation and the subsequent destruction of the Spanish Armada, and everything else that would come to follow. Ultimately, when asking who discovered America, it's a game of semantics, but for all practical purposes, as it applies to us today, Columbus discovered America. These two simple realities, that Columbus was both a terrible person who did terrible things and a trailblazing explorer, are not irreconcilable, and the only reason we treat them like they are is because of moronic culture war squabbles that have no bearing on historical reality. When looking at history, one must understand that the truth can sometimes be ugly, and that the people behind it are more complicated than we'd sometimes like for them to be. And so, when all has been said and done, and when all the ink on this trivial question has been spilled, there is something we should all be able to agree on. The Vikings most certainly didn't discover America.